people to show up, meaning David. And the second he gets on here, we can start chatting with him. I think there he is. Let's add him in there. Works. I think this is both of our first times doing Instagram Live, so we're both, you know, fairly cautious about this thing. Oh, hey, David, how's it going?
Oh, very good.
All right. Are you ready to get down and dirty with all the facts that I'm going to throw at you? Are you ready for some like real gotcha TEDx journalism?
Yeah. I don't really deal in facts.
Well, yeah, it's easier that way, right? Then no one can refute anything you say or do, right?
Well, you know, columnists.
Yeah.
We can do a columnist critique a different day.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think we'll give people just a bit of time to kind of come into this. So, you know, I have some pre-planned banter for you. I hope you're ready for this. Yeah. I noticed the beard. Now, is the beard a quarantine thing, or is that just your average everyday look?
I started this after the election because I was sick of shaving, and I'm sick of looking good for book tour stuff and for television. I just didn't want to do any of it anymore. So I sort of stopped doing television and then just started growing out and see what would happen. And then when the lockdown came, everybody was doing it.
Yeah.
But I outweighed them.
So you've been growing it out before it was cool then, is what you're saying.
This is from October, end of October. But you're seeing people, they're going soft. They get a couple months into the beard and then it's like, oh, I better trim. And then it's, I better work, you know, I'll just take a little off. And before you know it, they're just back to being beardless. But I can wait them out.
Yeah, there's that weird in-between phase when you're growing it that it just looks like it's pubic hair on your face and you kind of have to power through it, right? And you're just like, oh, this will be worth it. Just, you know, don't look at yourself in the mirror for a couple of weeks and then you get to it.
I never do.
Yeah, well, so I'm kind of curious. I noticed on your social media feed, you've been playing a lot of just video games to pass the time in quarantine. And you're mentioning like Don't Starve Together and a few others. There's a lot of video games that seem to apply to our situation. So what have you been playing?
There's something fascinating. I mean, this is, we could talk about this in politics and we could talk about this in culture. We can talk about this in all kinds of things. There's something fascinating about the apocalypse and about surviving. So I'm playing a lot of Fallout and a lot of Don't Starve Together. But I'm working on this theory that there's a kind of apocalypse hygge aesthetic. That there's something cozy about the apocalypse. I'm not really, there's just something about that coziness and community. So I got to work it out. I need someone to give me 3,000 words to work it out. But I've got this sense that there's a hygge appeal to the apocalypse.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's Danish, I think the term. Like I'm not going to pronounce it. You said it. You know what it is.
It's a Danish. Yeah.
So there's like an apocalypse comfort level. And is it just that we're so tired with everything we just want it to be done already? Like, is that the kind of theory there?
I think it's a theory of coziness. That there's a certain coziness that goes with it. But
well, all right. I guess we'll let you work that out in your 3,000 word article, and then you can come back and enlighten us with that, because that does sound interesting. It seems like there's been a lot of media in the last decade or so, especially kind of focused on sort of end times apocalyptic stuff. And, you know, people in jest are referring to this as like, you know, the end of days and stuff like that. And there does seem to be some sort of like subconscious longing for that to just have, I guess, a level of like finality or something. Who knows? But,
this ties into some work I'm doing on my next book, which we can talk about at the end. But there is some interesting psychological incentives to pay attention to this stuff.
Well, cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk about it a little later in the cast. I think we're a little ways into it, so we'll just get started with the official live stream here. So I'll say, welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Guilbert. I'm a member of the communications team with TEDxYYC. Thanks for tuning in to TEDxTalkback. So if this is your first time, a TEDx Talkback is a virtual interview with previous TEDxYYC speakers. Often when people watch a TEDx talk, so many new discussions just crop up and you have all these follow-up questions you want to ask. So this initiative is a way to explore these new ideas and dive deeper into our previous TEDxYYC speakers' ideas. So if you've got questions for our speaker, David, please share them in the comment box and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the 45 minutes or so we've got. So for those who don't know, our speaker today is David Moscrop. I think I said that right. The author of Too Dumb for Democracy, Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. He's a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Communications at the University of Ottawa, a columnist for Washington Post, and a frequent contributor to Maclean's magazine. He's also a political commentator for print, radio, and television. David gave the talk, Are We Too Dumb for Democracy, at our 2018 event. David, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, David, let's get right into it. For those who haven't seen your talk, can you give us a quick synopsis of what you were discussing?
Yeah, I was plugging my book, which was, the question is, can we make good political decisions? That's the fundamental question. And by that, I mean rational, autonomous, shareable, and consistent, which just means based on information about the world that's verifiably true, more or less, or at least defensible, based on reasons that you can communicate to others and that are more or less consistent and don't respond to arbitrary shifts in the world, like whether or not you're hungry, or whether or not the person speaking is someone you dislike, or for that matter, someone you like, or whether or not it's framed as risk or reward. You know, there's an old psychological trope about framing that if I ask you if you want a surgery and I say there's a 90% success rate, then you're going to say, I want it. If I say there's a 10% failure rate, you're going to say, I don't want it. Your decision shouldn't be affected by that because 90% success and 10% failure are logically equivalent. So the talk was about, can we make good decisions like that, given that the world around us is actually hostile to it? You know, things move too quickly. There's too much information at times. Partisan and other strategic actors sometimes don't want us to make good political decisions. They just want us to support them. And we're not trained to do good. We're not trained to think about this. We're not trained to value it. And we're not given the resources, including time and money, that it often takes to do that work. So the talk was about whether or not we can do that. And ultimately it was an argument that if we want to, and we should want to, because the stakes are high, we can.
So that's a very complicated topic. How did you first get that spark of, I want to study this, I want to research this?
Well, it was my dissertation. And so I committed the what I call the cardinal academic sin of taking my academic work and turning it into something that people would read, or at least I hoped would read. The incentives in academia are to produce peer-reviewed research, and often that's highly technical and often gated in one way or another, right? It's hard to access this stuff, and often academics aren't incentivized to share it publicly. Thank God they do the work they do. I mean, I joke about academics, but I'm glad they're doing their work, but I wanted to do public-facing work. So I took my dissertation and I turned it into a book that I hope people would be able to access and would enjoy. The origins of that were in me coming across a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, who wrote this great book called Looking for Spinoza. And it was about emotion in the brain and how it affects all kinds of things in our life. And he says in the intro of that book that, you know, it's important that we pay attention to neuroscience and by implication cognitive psychology and social psychology, because the way that we understand people will inform the way we build our institutions, the way that we build our day-to-day practices, the way that we do our politics, or the way that our economy is structured, or the way that our policing is structured, for instance. And that is extraordinarily important because the better we understand ourselves, for better or for worse, the better we can design institutions and practices and so on and so forth that can serve us. And so one of the things he was sort of saying was that this is political. Social psychology, political psychology, neuroscience, these things are political and have political implications. So I sort of went into that area to try to escape from politics for a while, but immediately got pulled back in and became extraordinarily interested in applying that stuff to democratic life.
So you went into it to try and escape politics for a bit. Can I ask why you wanted to escape politics for a bit?
Oh, I just get bored doing the same thing over and over again. I don't know how I don't know how academics do it. I don't know how some of these people study the same thing day in, day out their entire life. I find that just so boring after a while. I've had a lot of fun working on this for a couple of years, and I look forward to continuing to talk about it and to promote the book and do all that fun stuff. But I'm also looking forward to doing other things and different things and finding new angles. So that was just about escaping politics for a little while because I'd become kind of bored.
I think that's a sentiment that most people share with you right now. It just feels like there's a deluge of info all day, every day. And it's really hard to make up our minds about anything almost. If you've got a wide media diet, and you're looking at different opinions, it's almost impossible to kind of make up your own mind about this. So I know you've written about this and you've thought a lot about this. Can you give us some tips on how we can make our way through this deluge of information for Facebook?
I mean, the first thing is know when to stop looking at it. I mean, the part of the trap of social media and the 24-hour news cycle is that they're designed to keep you looking at them all the time. I mean, the whole social media ecosystem is built on eyeballs consistently looking, right? It's why we get clickbait. It's why fake news often thrives. It's why algorithms are designed the way that they're designed. Is that the fundamental interest of social media platforms is to keep eyeballs glued to the screen so that they can push ads on you. That's what they do. And that may be good for the bottom line, but it's probably terrible for your psychology. So knowing when to tune out is the first thing. A little can go a long way, provided you get the little right. So, part of this is just making sure that you have a variety of sources that aren't from just the same place, but that you trust, right? When, have a diversity of sources, that's critical, but also make sure that you trust those sources, because otherwise you end up doing yourself a disservice. Because ultimately, it's exhausting, right? It is exhausting to do this. It's exhausting to do it during a pandemic. It's exhausting to do it outside of a pandemic too. The good thing about representative democracy, the good thing about a lot of the institutions we've created is it allows lots of time not to be full-time citizens, right? Not to be full-time news consumers. I don't want to do that. Who wants to do that? It's miserable. But so a little goes a long way. But the trick is knowing when to come up with rules or come up with nudges or come up with systems that allow you to check out. And for me, it's just putting my phone on the little airplane mode and going to read a book and or play video games, whatever it might be, and having that physical distance. Because here's a big problem when it comes to information. Too little information doesn't do you any good. Too much information doesn't do you any good either. That's cognitively true as well. So there's a psychologist, Barry Schwartz, who wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. And I talked to him for the book. He says, at some point, you have so much information that you actually make worse decisions than if you had too little. And he cites the example of he walks into the Gap and he tries to buy blue jeans and he just cannot make up his mind. But there's studies about this that suggest the same thing is true of cars. If you're going to buy a car and you've got a handful of data points, safety, gas mileage, whatever it might be, then you make a pretty good decision. But if you've got a dozen different things you're trying to evaluate, it's just too much and you can't decide because you become overwhelmed. So, managing the amount of information that's coming across your eyeballs every day is extraordinarily important.
So how do you come up with your personal media diet? How do you find the sources that you trust? And how do you ensure that you have that right balance of diversity that you are looking for?
Well, it's going to be different for everyone. But for me, it's just a matter of having read through the media for years and having become friends with a lot of the people who do this work. I come across sources that I like and trust, both in terms of publications, but also in terms of people. And so I, for instance, use heuristics. I write about this in the book. We use mental shortcuts to help navigate the world. Well, I've got a handful of people in my life who I sort of look to and think, okay, well, what are they reading? And what are they saying? And that cues me to pay attention. And I'll dive in and have a look around, as well as going to 4 or 5 sources I sort of routinely go to just to see what's what. But I used to just wake up in the morning and go through a handful of sites. Now I sort of start on Twitter and see what people are saying, because I've curated a list of people I know and trust. So heuristics become important because if you get a good mix of people, then you don't fall into that pattern of just reading the same one or two things, right? You can see people coming from different angles. And, I spend, for instance, as much time reading stuff from the right as I do the left, deliberately, because I got sort of tired of just hearing what I already thought parroted back to me. I didn't need that. But every so often there was something new, so I kept those sources, but I started paying more attention to mainstream as well as right-wing outlets. And sometimes there was something useful there that I agreed with. Lots of times it just was something that provided a counterpoint to challenge what I thought of, so I could firm up what I thought. This is the old John Stuart Mill argument, that at the very least new information forces you to think about why you believe what you believe.
Mm-hmm. But I remember reading, and maybe this was in your book or another book, that when we encounter information that causes us that sort of cognitive dissonance of this doesn't match up with what I see the world as being, it actually activates our fight or flight response, right? It can be actually painful to encounter that stuff. And that's something you mentioned in your talk, is one of the things you recommend to people is to take 15 minutes to make yourself uncomfortable, right? So how often do you make yourself uncomfortable on a weekly basis? And how have you survived that this long?
Well, given my job, a lot, right? I mean, I spent a lot of time reading stuff I disagree with and engaging with people I disagree with, including some of them I just don't like. I mean, it's really hard to be in this space and to have to deal with people you just plain don't like for one reason or another. But you keep that inside to the extent that you can so you can do your job. But the fact is, when I notice something, whenever you go like this, or whenever you get really angry and your impulse is to rage tweet or to call someone an idiot or to get into a scrap, I have a little process. My first step in the process is to think, okay, why am I reacting that way, right? If you have a strong emotional reaction, the first step when you're processing information like news is, okay, well, what's that about? And it's often that I don't trust the source or I don't like the person saying it, because look, we're human beings. We're all going to go through that process, right? We all have that initial visceral reaction. It's like, right? Of contempt or disgust or just distrust or whatever it might be. But sometimes that reaction is wrong. Sometimes it's prejudicial. In fact, when you look at a lot of the nature of prejudice, it is that response, right? It is that emotional, immediate response, and it's toxic and it doesn't do a lot of good. And then, of course, there are some people who are just wretches, right, and forget them. But a lot of that response is just a sort of visceral prejudice. So I try to check it. I send it through a little process. And a lot of times I think, oh no, I'm right. That person said an awful thing and they're not a good person. But sometimes I'm wrong. And then I try to work out what that might be about. But really, all this is, the sort of making yourself uncomfortable, is about kicking yourself off of cognitive autopilot. Because we are what's known as cognitive misers, right? We like to do the most cognition, the most brain work we can with the fewest resources possible. We like to do autopilot. And evolutionarily speaking, that makes a lot of sense, because if you had to stop and think about everything that came across your desk, or every piece of stimuli that was going on right now, and the light coming through my window, the sirens outside, the smell of the whiskey beside me, all that, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. So we have to sort of do this selective parsing of the stuff that's around us. But when you're thinking about news or political decisions, you want to kick off of cognitive autopilot, because otherwise you're just going through the motions, and there's no guarantee that that's going to produce a good judgment or a good decision.
So I like the term cognitive miser. I encountered that in your book for the first time, and it was really useful to me in thinking about a lot of other things that I do in my life. You mentioned a lot of different cognitive biases that we're all subject to. Could you sort of go over maybe 2 or 3 that we're all trying to face down in trying to be better voters, better citizens?
Yeah, so there are countless cognitive biases, and you can look them up, and there's a whole list on the internet. Someone made a really cool chart that I had as my background on my computer for a while. There's good visualization work that's done with these. But one of the most common is availability bias. Things that pop into our heads that are easily available to us seem more important or more persuasive. So if every day you wake up and the newspaper is talking about littering, Or the newspaper's talking about people gathering in a park during a pandemic. And someone says, well, what's wrong with the pandemic response? Someone says, oh, everyone's just in the park all the time. You're coming up with that response because it's available to you. It seems important. It's at the top of your head. But that doesn't tell you anything about the large N data. That tells you nothing about whether or not these gatherings are common, whether or not they're contributing to, say, the growth in the pandemic, and so on and so forth. But the fact is, if you can call something to mind quickly, if it's available, it seems more persuasive and more important than it might be. Another cognitive bias, or what sometimes is a heuristic, but it depends a little bit on how it's used, is likability. If you like the person that's talking, you're more likely to agree with them, less likely to disagree with them. And of course, the converse is true for people that you don't like. That's a huge problem, right? And we have a really hard time disagreeing with people we like and agreeing with people we don't, which means that we're filtering out all kinds of perspectives and often good information. So part of managing these biases is, again, kicking ourselves off of autopilot so that we're not just adopting these cognitive shortcuts that often lead us astray. And the media does often a terrible job in this. Is that, it's tough because you've got to cover stories, but the way you cover and how often you cover can make something seem more or less important unless someone has the full scope or the full picture of what that data or what that story implies. Which is why ultimately numbers are what, stories sell, but numbers are what tell you the truth about what's going on in the world.
Well, it does remind me of the line, lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? You still got to figure out if that number is wholesale or per capita, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, yeah, numbers are pretty trustworthy compared to columnists, like you were saying. So I'm wondering, how is democracy different from, say, mob rule or populism, right? Like, what is your working definition for democracy?
Oof.
10 words or less. Yeah.
Someone has made a little whiskey emoji at the bottom of the stream, and so that I've been taken by that. I'm going to choose as a beat.
Yeah. If we can make this into a drinking game, I think it'd be a lot more fun for sure.
None of us will survive. I don't really have a working definition of democracy in the sense that my answer is sort of it depends, right? And people, theorists, and sort of commonly we boil down democracy to rule by the people, but I don't like, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Typically, democracy includes a responsive government that is elected through free, fair, and regular elections. It's typically, but not universally, representative, so there's typically representatives who are responsive. Good democracies have robust protections for minority rights. So, the way our democracy has evolved is that we don't, to the extent that we're nervous about populism, the thing we're nervous about often is majority rule running roughshod over minority rights. So democracy ends up requiring, at least our version of it, a fairly robust protection for minority rights. But I would push it further and say a good democracy is also deliberative. And this is where a lot of folks disagree, because when we think democracy, we tend to think of voting, which is a pretty blunt instrument. Now, you got to vote in most democracies. Ultimately, you got to put up your hand. But the way you get there matters too. So one version is you debate, or you argue, or you knock on doors, or you buy vote. You sort of buy influence one way or another, or you cajole it, or you mislead people into adopting your position, or that's the sort of winner-take-all mindset of, well, we're just going to put up our hands, and the most hands wins. The deliberative approach says what we actually want to do is sit down across from one another in a group, recognize one another as subjects who are partners in being governed in self-government, and exchange reasons back and forth for the things that we want and don't want for our preferences. So it's not about debate, and it's certainly not just about putting up your hand. It's about creating and forming preferences based on dialogue with the other person that's fundamentally rooted in reason giving. Reasons for and against, back and forth. And that's the version of democracy that I most like. It's not universally applicable, because good democracy also has civil disobedience. Good democracy has courts. Good democracy has legislatures. Good democracy has elections. Good democracy has protests. It has all this stuff too. But healthy democracies also have a contingent of deliberation. And that can happen in parliament. It can happen in the courts. It can happen in civic assemblies. It can happen all over the place. But to the extent that it's present, it tends to produce pretty good results.
Well, it's the worst system except for all the others, right? To quote Churchill, I think. So you mentioned the importance of dialogue to this ideal version of democracy. Can you sort of speak to that and then contrast that with what a lot of people are feeling is an increasing polarization? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know to what extent Canada is increasingly polarized. I mean, the U.S. plainly is. The U.K. might be. When we think polarization, we often think the U.S. And we do have data that suggests there's a great book called Democracy for Realists, which is a fantastic book on U.S. politics, and it bears out all your worst fears. I mean, it's not a beach read. I mean, it might be a beach read for some people, but it's not a pleasant read. If you're the sort of person that wants to read The Road on a beach, you might like Democracy for Realists, but it's not encouraging. Basically, the U.S. is becoming more polarized, and that's a risk all over the place because partisanship becomes identity, and it's not just you vote Republican or you vote Democrat. You are Republican, you are Democrat, and the other person is the other. They're different. And not just different, but bad. And not just bad, but a threat. And that threat needs to be neutralized. And then, of course, that polarizes and you get all the nastiness that you get. Often that breaks down around issues, economic issues, but also race issues. And then, of course, you start to see that sort of bubble up and become, well, quite literally lethal. And then justified, which is not just a threat to individual lives and well-being, an extraordinary one too that we're seeing continuously play out around the world, but also a threat to institutions. And so you start to see democracy crumble in some cases after that, or if it's already crumbling, potentially even collapse. So there is a lot of danger there in polarization. And when I talk about dialogue and deliberation, I talk about that as a component to a healthy democracy, but it's not one size fits all. It's not the solution to everything. It's hard to look at some countries right now and say, oh, you just need more dialogue, or you just need to vote. Because a lot of folks are going to say, that doesn't work for us, right? Voting doesn't work. Dialogue hasn't worked. We've been patient. We've tried this. It's just not going to happen. And that's where you see things like riots, or you see civil disobedience, and you see protest. And my response to that is, you probably need it. There are a lot of cases where that's got to be what happens because the other avenues aren't working. But in a healthy democracy, when you can channel that stuff into dialogue and deliberation, you stand a chance, I think a better chance, of producing a healthier democratic discourse. But I want to be very careful not to make it seem like I think you can sit down and deliberate or discuss your way out of every problem in every case, because you can't. Or in the same way that you can't vote your way out of a lot of that stuff either. So when I'm talking about deliberation and dialogue, I'm talking about building that stuff into our institutions, like into Parliament, or into civic assemblies that draw citizens into formalized decision-making bodies that are deliberative. And this all happens under the ambit of a democratic system. That you think of democracy as a system with lots of different points and lots of different institutions and lots of different practices, instead of saying democracy is about voting, or democracy is about deliberation, or democracy is just about protest, because it's about all of those things.
So how does democracy reconcile itself with minority rights, right? Because essentially, 50% plus one is who decides what happens in one way or another. So how do we enshrine minority rights within a democracy in a way that's realistic?
Well, I mean, the model for liberal democracy, at least, is constitutionalism for the most part. Is that you adopt a set of rules, fundamental rules, say the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and you say these are our values, these are our principles, this is who we are and who we want to be, and we're going to evaluate not just the present but also the future through this lens. And the battle then is going to the political battle, at least in part, will revolve around constitutional battles. And in Canada, you see a lot of minority right wins proceeding through legal means. And if you look at a lot of the nice things that Canada has had in the last couple of decades, often far too late, you've noticed that they come through the courts, one way or the other, right? Decisions around sex work, or assisted dying, or same-sex marriage. And what you end up doing is the society, as we go along, sends things through the legal channel. Now, that upsets a lot of people who say that should be a political decision. But the fact is, if you're going to adopt a set of principles and values and say, this is who we are, then you're going to have to live up to those. And you're going to have some mechanism. That's often going to be the courts. But the fact is, these are ultimately some mix of political and legal battle most of the time. And that's, you figure that out through, again, a combination of different things, through legal battles, through protests, through legislatures, through activists who are putting their well-being, their careers, their bodies on the line, their safety on the line to push for this. And I think one of the things that's notable about a healthy democracy is that it has organizations and activists who are pushing that democracy to be better. And in Canada, we're really lucky to have a lot of groups and individuals who are doing that work, who are constantly doing that work, fighting for the rights of racialized folks still, fighting for the rights of individuals living with disabilities, for instance, who are saying, whatever you think this country is, whatever this country tells you it is, we see something different, here's what it is. Here's the other side of it. And I see more of that now than I've ever seen. I'm more encouraged now by the strength of activist communities, for instance, than I've ever been. There's a lot of energy and power and potential there. And so you see the fact that it becomes a political battle to recognize those individual and minority rights and to protect them. And, Canada isn't the utopia we often imagine ourselves, we are told we are. But the fact is, there are a lot of wins that are fought for, sometimes by politicians, but almost always by people who are doing the hard work of organizing and pushing behind the scenes. And so, minority rights don't just happen. They are something that are fought for routinely by people and backstop to some extent through constitutionalism.
That's a very good and thorough answer. Thank you for that. I want to switch a little bit back to the title of your TED Talk and your book, Are We Too Dumb for Democracy? Hold up. We got a question in the chat, so I'm going to just ask you that right now. Kurt is asking, how can we better enshrine evidence-based decision-making at all political levels?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if we can. The fact is, we can adopt processes. Courts do this, for instance, right? Courts have extraordinarily robust processes for evidence-based decisions, right? There is a whole apparatus set up to do that. Parliament has that to some extent too, but often the evidence gets filtered through a political process. And the fact is, we want it to be filtered through a political process. As my thesis supervisor at UBC, Mark Warren, would say, in a democracy, when it comes to public policy, science has no pre-political authority. Expertise, science, all that stuff, it may have an objective truth value out in the world, but you have to send it through the public policy process because that's a democracy. Because we disagree about who the experts are, we disagree about what the evidence says, and we disagree about what the implication of that evidence is. Or you might say, I don't care what the evidence is. I still want to do this, right? People might say, you, the experts, say X, Y, or Z implies A, B, C, but I don't care, right? And so that's why we want to run all of that evidence, all of the expertise, all of that through a political process of, say, committee hearings and debates in Parliament and votes on legislation and ultimately elections. We run that stuff through the political process. But you still want to rely on that evidence so that at least we have reasons and data and facts that are backing up what we're talking about. And part of that is going to be politicians who value it and voters who reward or punish them based on whether or not they value that. Part of it is going to be processes like civic assemblies where we have individuals brought into the political process, or robust committee processes that are calling good experts who are giving good testimony and influencing parliamentarians. or parties that care about data, right? I mean, part of this is going to have to be elite-driven because the elites remain gatekeepers. It's going to take a news media that is consistent to seek out facts, to evaluate facts, and to pass a judgment. And that's going to be a huge battlefront in the next couple of years and perhaps decades, because folks in the media are under a lot of strain. They're doing more with less, and the future of the media space is unclear. So part of that challenge about ensuring that you've got good data-based evidence is making sure you've got a good news media to back that up. So that's all by way of saying, again, you need to do it through several different avenues. But if you come across a good procedure, like a citizens' assembly, and you can enshrine that institutionally into your process and say, look, we're going to have a citizens' assembly every 5 years to set the agenda. We're going to have the public say, here are the 5 things we care about, and here's why, and that's going to guide politicians. Then you can start to encourage some of that by setting up institutions that send those signals.
Great.
Don't want to technocracy. I'll finish real quickly on this. You know, people often say, I don't care what happens, just let the experts decide, well, why don't we listen to the evidence? That's really dangerous, because when you try to take politics out of this process, you end up with a technocracy, a rule by elite experts, not by people. And that probably doesn't work well. It's probably not responsive, and it probably risks a backlash. So we want to be careful that we don't give in to technocracy.
That's a great and very, I wish I could jump in, but we've got more questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to those first. So how do we trust in the political process in times with people like Trump, given the implications?
Given the implications? Yeah, I don't trust the American political process. Not at the moment, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. Now, there's a difference between saying you don't trust it because you are worried that the president is undermining it, which is a critical point that I think is true, and saying, oh, I don't trust it because, you know, postal ballots are rigged, which is not true. So part of the trust question is interrogating what are actual dangerous areas where you ought to be distrustful. Voting machines, for instance, in some cases, which are hackable. You know, anything that's digital democracy is worthy of being suspicious of in terms of voting. You know, frankly, racist and classist voting rules that are being set up around states in the U.S., right, to keep folks from voting, especially racialized folks. Gerrymandering, things like that. When you look at that and you say, well, I don't trust the process because of those things, the answer is no, you shouldn't, because these are politicized, exclusionary, dangerous processes, which is a lot different than saying, oh, postal ballots are rigged, which is just not true. This is where the evidence becomes important. So the question is, how do you change those procedures to reintroduce trust? And again, it's going to be a combination of elite-led efforts, but also folks marching and saying, no, thank you. This doesn't suit us. It's an open question whether or not the U.S. can come back from the institutional and democratic decay of the last 60 years. I don't know. I really don't. And a lot of smart folks are thinking about this and talking about it, and they're not sure either. The U.S. may be a lost cause. We don't know. We're fighting for, because there's a lot on the line, but who knows? That democratic decline has been happening for some time. So you know, it's something to pay close attention to. Compare that to Canada, where things work much better in terms of process, right? Our institutions are better. And that maybe therein lies some of the solutions, that we can look around the world and say whose elections work well, whose elections don't work well, and what are best practices. Paper, pencil, little ballot screen, box. We know that's a pretty good way to vote. It's safe, right? We know that works. Having Elections Canada, a federal, nonpartisan, autonomous body that reports to Parliament, which is much better than a lot of systems around the world, for instance, including the American system. Having states set voting rules has been a mess in many cases in the U.S., right? We see the things that don't work. The question is there the political will to change those things or not? And again, that's going to vary country to country. But it's worth noting that all of this is taking place against the background of global democratic decline, global democratic recession. So we ought to be vigilant and pay close attention and to take it seriously, because there's no guarantee that democracy survives. As I wrote in my book, democracy has historically been the exception to the rule. It doesn't come around often. It doesn't last that long. So there's no guarantee it survives. It takes the work of each and every generation, one generation after the next, to reaffirm it and to protect it, because if not, it crumbles far more easily than we might hope.
Well, I'm depressed, so thanks for that. Jeez.
Happy Friday!
Can I ask, you said the sort of democratic decay in the U.S. for the last 60 or so years. Is that just a general term, or is there some sort of like phenomena that happened 60 odd years ago that is the starting point for where we are now?
So there's a great book called How Democracies Die by Ziblatt and Levitsky, and they talk a bit about this. But the fact is, America is founded on at least two great crimes, right? The genocide of indigenous people and slavery. And Ziblatt and Levitsky talk about how, when it comes to slavery in the U.S., that had the sort of attitudes, racial attitudes, have been a huge problem for the U.S. ever since. I mean, that's obvious. But they say, elites started to pull apart from each other in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. And the reason was there had been a sort of bargain that the Democrats and the Republicans had made with one another, basically to ignore civil rights, to keep the peace. Obviously, that is evil. There's no other word for it. That is a Faustian bargain at best. It's evil. That starts to unwind because Democrats start to introduce civil rights legislation, and there's an argument that actually leads to a lot of the tension that is played out. Of course, that is because the U.S. is founded on, again, two great crimes. And they are living the legacy of both of them for sure, but it's certainly, as we see right now, of slavery and of continued oppression of racialized folks. Also, they've got a stupid system. I mean, the American political system is ridiculous. The presidential congressional system, the way it's designed in the U.S., was supposed to be such that Congress would check the executive, would check the judicial, and back and forth, right? You'd have these three branches of government checking one another. But what happens is it gets polarized around partisan identity lines, and instead of those branches checking each other, what you get is parties colluding across branches to try to run an oligarchy, right? On top of all of the racism and prejudice and big money and everything that goes into producing gridlock and bad decisions and oppression, all kinds of nastiness in the U.S. So there's a lot conspiring to make the U.S. a long shot as the shining beacon of freedom it likes to pretend that it is, and it's unlikely that that's sustainable. So something's got to give. So the U.S. has a couple of really big problems, but the final thing is forbearance. And Ziblatt and Levitsky talk about this. They say, forbearance is basically this. There are things that you can do as an elite, as a political party, as a leader, as a president. You can get away with doing it. You might even win doing it, but you shouldn't do it because it harms democracy. It undermines the institutions. It creates distrust. In the long run, it's corrosive, even though you can get away with it. So good democracies have elites who practice forbearance. There are things they can do, but they don't do them because they know that it will make a mess. That is crumbling in the U.S. Forbearance is crumbling, and Trump is a great example of that, and is an authoritarian to boot. So, does 4 years of Biden solve that? If you get Biden, I sincerely doubt it. But a return to forbearance ought to be at the top of the American agenda, alongside a structural reform to address endemic and lethal racism and sexism and prejudice, which is also clearly undoing the fabric of that country.
Well, that's an incredibly complicated situation then. I'll just take a minute to say to anyone in the chat, we're in the home stretch here, so if you do have questions for David, now would be the time to ask them. And I really do encourage you to take this opportunity, because it's not often you get to talk to someone with David's background about this sort of stuff. So David, I do want to ask, you mentioned the sort of collusion across the sort of checks and balances systems in the states. Is the two-party system a part of that issue? Do you think if there was more parties that were viable in the states, it would help solve things a little bit, or is that not enough?
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by that. I mean, multipartyism on its own in the U.S. in a winner-take-all system might not matter. In a proportional representation system, things might change. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts there, so it's hard to say that proportional representation, which is an electoral system where seats are proportionally returned to people rather than whoever gets the most votes wins. That something like that might help. But the problem, I mean, one of the fundamental problems of American democracy is that partisanship is an identity. It's polarized. The other party is seen as the enemy, and these parties capture branches of government and then collude to try to keep that other party out because they see them as an existential threat to the republic. And you've seen this going back, again, decades. It's certainly much worse in 2020 than it was in 1980, but it was still around. It was present in 1980. So maybe multipartyism would help shake that up a little bit, but only if you had parties that would check each other at different branches, or to some extent in the legislature. But that's only part of it. The other part of it, of course, is money. Is that everybody knows there's a significant problem with money in the U.S. That money is thought of as speech in the U.S. It's not in Canada, and it's corrosive. And in fact, worse than corrosive, it leads to policies that don't represent the preferences of the people. And there's a paper from a few years ago by Gillis and Page where they studied policy in the U.S. from, I think, 1970 or so to 2012. And they found that the vast majority of policies that Americans get are policies that the elite want, right? It is really, rule by the few for the few. And that's a recipe for disaster in the U.S. So part of it is, the key to it is trying to limit the influence of money and limit the influence of elites so that they don't dominate the legislative agenda and just give, the country what elites want. Because in the end, that's not going to work for folks. And look no further than the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis to see that who gets screwed and who gets rewarded for tanking the global economy. That's not sustainable.
So we got a question in the chat here. So given the video games and the beard, if there is no hope for democracy, should we just move to cults?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, great.
Wait, am I the leader?
It seems like you could be.
Then yes.
Okay. All right. Well,
that's an important asterisk, though.
Yeah, only cults that David's in charge of. Okay. So I know we're getting near the end. I wanted to ask you about what you're working on right now. So I understand you're kind of working away on a new book. Is that right?
2 books.
2 books. Okay.
I got a lot of time.
So let's hear about it.
One's a novel, and it's in the editing stages. So I'm finishing up edits on a novel that'll get shipped off in the next couple of weeks. And it's a sort of thriller, mystery, the sort of thing that I want to read. So hopefully that gets out into the world in the next year or so. And the other book is about existential threats to humankind and our fascination with the apocalypse. Because I am fascinated with our fascination with the end. There's something about the end times that draws us in, right? There's something about disaster that we can't look away from. It's fascinating to us. And psychologically, what one person interviewee told me was, we have evolved to pay attention to these things because we're supposed to notice them, to avoid, right? And to adapt. But I find the fascination with it utterly compelling. And so I'm going through different threats to humankind and writing about them and talking about what draws us to the end times. And I got to say, I planned this book 18 months ago, a year ago, I started working on it. And looking back through the pandemic section of the proposal, I got to say, I might have understated things a little bit. And at the time, I thought it was ridiculous. I'm like, oh, come on. But now we're seeing it. So the book's going to look like a little bit of a COVID-19 response thing, but the fact is I've been working on it for a long time. But one of the important things that I'm trying to get across in the book, and I think we should keep in mind now with COVID, is that these are challenges that are extraordinary. They're catastrophic and often tragic, but they are things we can survive. And they're things we can survive if we make good political decisions, but also things that present us with an opportunity to decide how we want to live going forward. We've reached what you call a critical juncture. We didn't ask for it. We might not want it. It might be difficult and tragic, but it's also an opportunity to say, how do we want to live together? What was wrong about the old way? Oh, and by the way, in the meantime, who's doing the brunt of the work here? Who's suffering the most? Who are we ignoring? How can we pay attention to them? And how can we ensure that going forward, not only are these things less likely to happen again, we don't continue to marginalize those who have been marginalized in the past, who are bearing unreasonable and disproportionate burdens currently, and who ought to be given justice now and in the future. So there's a lot of opportunity in challenge and even in collapse that we ought to keep in mind as we go forward.
Great. You really do have spectacular timing then if you didn't plan this during the pandemic.
The secret is to always bet against the market.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind.
I'm just kidding. Hope springs eternal.
Okay. And we want to try and end this on a happier note. We do have a question in the chat that I want to put to you. So it says, despite the virtues of Canadian democracy, it still seems to function within the same framework of most modern Western democracies. Do you think this framework truly allows for greater democracy, or does the entire framework need to shift?
Well, my argument is that we can introduce more participatory and representative democracy through personal practices and institutional practices like citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting. We can be more responsive. We can be more inclusive. We can, at the moment when you think you might want to back off of democracy because you're worried, that's probably the moment you should double down on it. But you should double down on it by making sure that you're having inclusive institutional processes that bring people in and give them a chance to influence policy outcomes. So I do think, that's true. We're operating in that general framework, but there's a lot of room to introduce more participatory elements so that citizens can have a greater say, so that folks that aren't necessarily going to be heard have a chance to be heard, so we can build civic capacity, and so that we can keep trust in the system. And part of it is if people don't get the policies they want, they're going to stop believing in the system. They're going to be harmed because they're not going to get what they need to survive. But they're also going to become distrustful and alienated, and in some cases even violent, and understandably so in some cases. Violence is often signaling the breakdown of a political institution and process. But sometimes it is a sort of a cry of desperation for people who have been so deeply marginalized that they say there's no room for us inside the political process. We're not being heard. We're being marginalized. We're being killed. And no matter what we do, we can't be a part. We're not brought into this process. And so it erupts into civil disobedience, often peaceful. It erupts into protests, often peaceful, but sometimes into riots and violence, which we obviously don't want. But that isn't about hooliganism, typically. It's about deep frustration and alienation, and a cry for a more inclusive and just and healthier democracy. So these are things you want to work on well before it ever gets to that point. And that's the secret, is bringing people in now, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be and the worse it's going to be, right? And if you look back through the history of revolutions, they're often preceded by people wanting in. People want in, and they signal wanting in, and they knock on the door, and they ask to be brought in, and they struggle to be brought in, and they struggle to go through the processes. And that's the moment where you really got to make sure you bring them in, because if not, you're in big, big trouble. And I think looking around the world at the state of democracy right now, we ought to pay very close attention to our economic and political institutions and to make sure they're representative and inclusive. Because if we don't get it right now, it's going to be way worse to try to get it right later, way more difficult. And we're going to have to do that at the same time that we say we're tackling climate change, which will present its own problems. So, if I could send one big message, is that if you want your democracy to function, it has to be participatory, it has to be inclusive, but so does your economy. Your economy has to be participatory too. You can't have a functioning democracy if you don't have a democratic economy. And so these are all things we're going to have to deal with immediately. And again, COVID-19 has presented a critical juncture at which we can start to deal with those things, and including climate change. And it would be wise to do it now, because it's never going to get easier than it is right now. And now it's difficult. It's only going to get harder. So now's the time to do it. And I would do it myself, but I've got these books and these video games.
Yeah, you got a valid excuse for not taking the reins on this one. So
I'm trying, and if I can be useful, I'm always keen on helping. And actually, I'll really quickly slide in that point. There is a huge part of a healthy democracy is listening. A huge part of a healthy democracy is knowing when not to talk but to listen. Knowing when not to talk but to amplify other people, especially those who aren't typically amplified or brought into the conversation. So a big part of what especially elites can do inside the media, outside the media, in their communities, municipally, provincially, federally, is bring others into the conversation, especially those who are typically left out, amplify them, and then listen to them. Because one of the big challenges of democratic participatory actions in Canada historically is that we get lots of good advice, and then we don't take it up, and we don't listen, and it becomes democracy washing. So a huge part of ensuring trust in the system and justice in the system is knowing when to shut up and listen, and when to act on what folks are telling you, because the best way to know what someone in a democracy wants is to ask them and to listen to them. And we don't do nearly enough of that. So that's going to be another big important part of it. And that's going to be people like you, people like me, and certainly every MP in the House of Commons and every MLA or MPP in provincial legislatures and every city councillor across the country. And in that, if we can do that, if we can listen, then we have a better chance at a more responsive and inclusive legislative agenda. And if we can get that, then we can have a shot at maintaining trust and keeping this thing going for decades, if not centuries to come.
Well, I think regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, we can all agree that that's something that we want to achieve. So I think that's an appropriate call to action for sure. Now, I think we're gonna wrap it up in just a minute, but I find that when we talk about politics, it very often sort of degenerates into doom mongering because it's so easy to focus on the negative. So I'm wondering, what do you see in the world right now that gives you hope?
Well, a couple things. Lots of participatory democratic practices around the world. There's a website called participedia.org that lists all of the stuff that's happening that are participatory engagements. There's lots of that going on. But I'm seeing the rise of powerful, informed, politicized folks who are organized, many of whom are young, many of whom are marginalized or have previously been marginalized, who are organizing and pushing back. So, far be it from, far away from the idea of this of the apathetic population that doesn't care and is deeply tuned out. There's actually, I've never met an apathetic person in my life. I've met lots of alienated people, but that's different than being apathetic. People care. They're just alienated. But I'm seeing a lot, these shoots are popping out of the ground of folks who are deeply engaged and pressing for justice, taking to the streets, calling for action, dominating social media, and demanding a better world. And there's nothing, I think, more indicative of that than the climate marches. Whatever you might think of the climate marches, I've never seen that many people in Canada mobilize for anything. Have you? I mean, I don't think there's, you had the Winnipeg General Strike, you had these pockets of, but a national mobilization, there's a lot of hope there. And a lot of the hope is in young folks who are coming out and demanding more, and in new voices that are taking the stage and taking up space, thank God. So there's a lot of hope. But again, we ought to listen to them. Now, the other side of the equation is listening to them and then doing what they tell you to do. And there's some indications that there's going to be more of that in the future. But again, this doesn't happen by accident. This happens because people are organizing. It happens because people are doing the work behind the scenes. They're putting their lives on the line in some cases to do it. It happens because people are out there making it happen. And I have a lot of faith that people are going to keep making it happen and force politicians to do the right thing, if not become politicians themselves and do it. So I'm ultimately hopeful that there's a series of critical junctures that are emerging that are going to be opportunities for people like that to help usher in change that's going to keep us around for a long time. But again, more importantly, keep us around in a way that is sustainable and just.
So what I'm hearing is you're going to be running for Parliament soon. Is that right?
Not with this beard, I'm not.
All right. Well, it's about time to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone in the chat, for listening to us. Be sure to tune in next Talkback, which is coming up in 2 weeks on Friday, June 12th. David, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who listened, and especially those who offered some questions.
All right. If anyone's got more questions for David and you just have to get them out, you can DM us and we'll send them his way. All right. Thanks, everybody.